Hello, my name is Tom Fleming. I'm an old friend of Frank's, and like many of his old friends, we were sparring partners. I occasionally served as his punching bag. I have a question I want to ask everybody. Are there any knuckleheads out here? How about anybody ever called Bucky? Have you ever had your arm pounded or your back slapped so hard that you felt it 2 days later? Then you know Frank. When Frank Schier walked into a room with his hearty har-har laugh and his breezy, hearty familiarity, it always hit me that he must have been a pirate in a previous existence. I'd only met him once or twice when he fell into calling me Tommy, a name I had not allowed anybody to use outside my family since I was 12 years old. With anybody else, I would have resented it. With Frank, I just responded by forever calling him Frankie, or, when he really disliked, Francis. And I called him that for the rest of his much too brief life. For a while, Frank and I had a local access TV show. I think it probably had the lowest ratings in the history of TV. And I occasionally wrote restaurant pieces for the Rock River Times. And so maybe they'll put that in on my tombstone. Frank was a larger-than-life character, I think we all know that, with an enormous appetite for living. I'm not referring specifically to his eating habits. Though in his glory days, his eating, the only word I can use to describe it, it was prodigious. Eating with Frank was always an adventure. Like the true gourmet that he was, he had his own rating system for restaurants and meals. Some food critics use stars or forks to indicate their approval or the quality of the restaurant. But Frank would rate a dinner in terms of oinks. That was 5 oinks, he would say, after eating one of my wife's exquisite dinners. Some years ago, a group of us had driven out of Springfield for various business. Frank was going to check out contributions to Rockford politicians. If there are any Rockford politicians here, you don't have to swerve. I'm not going to reveal anything. Frank had eaten an enormous lunch that I believe included Springfield's disgusting signature dish, the famous horseshoe sandwich, described on the internet as thick sliced toasted Texas toast, a large hamburger patty, French fries, and a secret cheese sauce that seems remarkably like Cheese Whiz melted in a pan. By the time we hit the LaSalle, Peru area, it was about 3:30, and Frank had to stop for a little snack. A double cheeseburger, large order of fries, and a milkshake, hoping this would tide him over till we got to Rockford. Once we went on a camping trip with my younger son Garrett on Lake Koshkonong. Well, we stopped for groceries in Fort Atkinson. Now, since I was very small, I've always got stuck being the camp cook, so I'm used to ordering food for camping trips and having to cook out. I bought maybe 50% more than we could possibly eat because both Frank and Garrett were big eaters. Well, Frank looked at my shopping cart in disgust. He quickly added string cheese, bologna, salami, another dozen eggs, another pound of bacon, several large bags of generic potato chips. Next morning, and 2 cases of beer. Next morning, as usual, I was making breakfast. I gave each of us 2 or 3 eggs, 3 or 4 strips of bacon, a lot of toast and coffee. And when we finished what is for me a gigantic breakfast, Frank and Garrett then turned around and scrambled a dozen eggs and cooked a pound of bacon and ate it. I could spend the afternoon telling of some of Frank's exploits in eating, but there was even a pizza named after him at Canova's. I wanted them to change the name to Sheer Madness, but Frank wouldn't have it. The first time I met Frank, it was after a political event here in Rockford, and you know, it was getting late, and so people proposed that we go out to eat. But all the suggestions were for one or another chain restaurant out on the east side cancer that was already spreading towards Chicago. It's if you ever saw the Daily Show program on the Wisconsin legislators who holed up there at the Tilted Kilt. They called it the Forbidden Zone. Well, Frank refused to go up to the Forbidden Zone and insisted that you had to eat downtown, usually at the Irish Rose or some other local joint. But when I said that Frank had an enormous appetite for living, I really wasn't thinking of food, but primarily of the gusto he displayed in everything he took an interest in. From putting out his weekly paper, to canoeing the Rock River, learning guitar, writing poetry, promoting interest in the local music scene, and taking part in every conspiracy against the powers that be here in Rockford. Was he always successful? Always prudent? Even a little careful? No. But we could never give Frank less than an E for effort, even for his poetry. Speaking of political conspiracies, I really got to know him during the patriotic uprising against a foreign ruler that was occupying Rockford. I'm referring to Magistrate Michael Mahoney, who after all did come from Freeport. And Mahoney had after all assumed dictatorial power over the Rockford School District. It was during that fight against the Rockford Register-Star and the local political gang that continues to run Rockford that a kind of robber band of rebels emerged. It was like one of those movies, you know, that begins, like the Magnificent Seven or the Dirty Dozen. You have to go around collecting all the misfits, dropouts, losers, eccentrics. And then in the end, they accomplish a miracle. It was Chris Bowman, Stephanie Caltagirone, other school board members like Patty DeLucas and Ted Biondo. There were even people in government like Mariana Yellow and Pete McKay, especially when there was the fight over the quick take of part of the Ditzler farm. There were so many fights in those days, so few victories, but it never seemed to depress Frank's indomitable spirit. Frank threw himself into every fight, often with more enthusiasm than reflection, and his occasional fit of recklessness caused breaches and quarrels with some of his oldest friends. I can't tell you how many times I had to serve as intermediary with, say, Chris Bowman, or try to patch things up with Mike Leifheit. But I finally figured out what the key to Frank's personality was. He was half Irish, half German. The Irish half was constantly coming up with crazy ideas that the ordinary Irishman would just get drunk and then forget about it the next day. But Frank, being half German, he would cling to it with tenacity. It was always easy to quarrel with Frank, but very difficult to stay angry with him. And to those few who hated him, and continue to hate him to this day, I can only say that if they want to know the source of their anger and hatred, they should really look in the mirror and not look to Frank. The hallmark of Frank was his loyalty to friends who could never pay him back for the incredible kindness which he showed over and over. It's already been mentioned, his Peter Stanlis and Eleanor Stanlis, who had Eleanor created perhaps the most significant cultural institution in Rockford, and from which our own children benefited so much over the years in their music lessons. His friend, the poet Red Hargraves, who had a letter praise from Ezra Pound. Frank was, I think, the only person in Rockford who knew all of that. But, you know, even though these people were often quite different from Frank, Peter Stanlis was a rock rib, right-wing conservative and good Catholic. He was 180 degrees away from most of what Frank believed, but this in no way could interrupt Frank's loyalty or his friendship. Frank Schier was one of the last people on earth who really loved Rockford, both for what it is and for what he thought it could be. He went out to the West Coast for a while where he, as he put it, he had a blast, but he had to come back here. And despite a string of disappointments, He stayed here as a living embodiment of the local historical and cultural memory. Frank could tell you stories of Black Hawk all day, or he could even make sense out of an Indian mound when you're walking around Lake Koshkonong. What looked to me like just heaps of eroded mud, Frank would see, he said, well, that's a turtle, or that's a deer. That's, improbably he'd say, that's a crocodile. I'd say, well, where did that come from? Well, it swam up the Rock River. I think if Frank went out to a golf course, he could see all the greens as Indian mounds. But Frank's imagination could see things not just as they happened to be, but as they were supposed to be. And if he were here, I would quote to him a poem from Wallace Stevens, the man with the blue guitar, who played things not as they are. Frank was forever nudging Rockford in the right direction, toward cleaning up the river, toward preserving the historic downtown, toward enlivening and enriching our local culture. Sometimes his gentle nudges turned into hectoring and bullying, but everything he did was out of love for his city, the river, and the people. Rockford will survive the loss of Frank Schier, but it's going to be a different place for a long time. It'll be colder, it'll be less interesting. When I was a child, I used to wonder, whatever happened to the Greek gods or the Norse gods? Did they go away? Did they die? I decided that so long as somebody worshiped them and loved them, they would still be alive somewhere. And I think the same thing is true of Rockford. As long as Frank Schier was here to love it, Rockford would continue to exist. Without Frank to love it, will Rockford be alive anymore? Well, I know we'll all miss it. And all I have to say in conclusion is, so long, knucklehead. It was good to know.